Hi, in this video, we're going to be talking about the advantages of using research logs and also going through a little bit of a sample of using a research log. So we've posted for you a sample research log on Blackboard to use with the first legal research project that you have due for the class. So this is just one sample. You may have used a different research log in another class or at work maybe. As you become a more experienced researcher, you might develop your own research log that's particular to the kind of research you usually do. It doesn't really matter what format it takes. It usually has the same sort of basic categories, and we're going to go through those. So what are the advantages of using a research log? Well, the first reason I like to use it is because I think it helps you brainstorm before you even jump online and start potentially on a fee service like our Lexis, maybe driving up that bill for your client or your law firm. You're actually thinking about the problem. You're writing down the facts, what you think the potential areas of law might be. You're sort of brainstorming ahead of time, and I think that's a really good practice to get into. What are the other reasons you might use a research log? Well, if you're pulled away from research that you're doing to work on a more pressing matter, when you come back to the matter you were initially researching, you can start right where you left off using your research log. If you're asked to research a similar issue months or even years later, you'll have that research log to kind of jumpstart your research. If you are assigned a research project by a supervising attorney and you're not finding anything, it sort of documents the steps that you took. So when you go to meet with that attorney, you can say, look, I did look in all these places, and it justifies the time that you spent is one thing. And then the second thing is the attorney who's supervising the work can maybe give you some suggestions based on what you've already done. In the same way, if you're billing your client for the research, it can justify the time that you spent. And for this class, it's also going to show us that you know how to use the tools and the skills that we've been trying to teach you. And if there are things that could be improved by reading through your research log, we're going to be able to give you suggestions. Okay, so those are all some reasons to use the research log now. Let's go through our fact pattern. So my son was kind enough to draw us this little picture to go with our fact pattern. And the facts are you have a client, David Jones of Mendon, Massachusetts. He's come for you to help with an ongoing problem with his neighbor, Ziggy Dust. So this is our client's house in his nice clean yard, and this is Ziggy's house in his yard. David tells you that his neighbor keeps a large pile of wood within a few feet of the property line. Here's our wood. And that the wood is starting to rot, and there's large spiders and termites, and they're infesting this lovely fence. That's David's fence on his property. David says he's asked Ziggy several times to get rid of the wood or to move it farther away from David's fence. He tells you Ziggy has flatly refused, stating he can do what he wants on his own property. He wants to know what his options are. Can he get any kind of order to have the wood removed? Can he sue for the cost of a new fence? So that's our research problem. So the first part of the research log asks you to jot down the initial facts. And we know our client is David Jones. If we were at a law firm, we'd probably have also a client matter number would be putting in terms of the initial facts. We know our parties. The date would be recent. We know it's in Mendon, Mass, so our jurisdiction is Massachusetts. It's probably a state law issue, right? When you do your brainstorming, it's probably civil law, property, maybe tort. Going off the top of my head, I was thinking maybe there could be some municipal law issues. We haven't done that yet in class, but I was just brainstorming, okay? So these are the types of things, and this is an abbreviated version. These are some examples of what the types of things you could put down in that initial facts section. All right, the next section has to deal with your client goals. So here I like to put both their legal and non-legal goals. So in this case, maybe a non-legal goal, an example of that would be preserving his relationship with his neighbor. Also, I put in this section if there's any limits on how much time I can spend. So this was me meeting with a client, so I don't have a supervising attorney telling me, only spend 2 hours or send me a quick email or write a brief. So I don't have the structure that maybe working with a senior attorney would give me. But I can be sort of brainstorming and thinking, how much does that fence cost? And how much is David really going to be willing to spend to resolve this matter, right? Okay, so these are the types of things, again, that you would put in this section. The all-important research plan section. So I like to try and brainstorm about the first sources that might be helpful, what search terms, if I think there's additional information I might want to go back and ask the client or the attorney I'm working for. And then I like to keep some good notes on the searches I've run. So for this problem, I was thinking right off the bat a treatise or practice guide in Massachusetts property law, maybe tort law. And then I just brainstormed a few search terms. Probably I would have more if this wasn't just a short example. And the types of additional information I might need, for example, I might want to get an estimate on the cost to replace the fence. All right. In addition to the brainstorming exercise in the research plan, I can also keep my search notes here. This section would be really long in my own research log, much longer than what I'm going to show you. These are just some examples. So for search notes, the first place I looked was the Mass Trial Courts page because it's free, and I noted down a resource that was helpful, and I put a little note to myself. It's about trees, but it looked like it could be helpful. So I'm putting where I looked, the link in this case, and then a note. And showing you an example here of a Google search I ran. I put down my search terms in this case. So in the Mass Trial Courts page, I navigated by browsing, but in Google, I wanted to put my search terms. I noted down one example. I probably would have several here if there actually were several pages I could have written down here, but I only have so much room on the slide. But you would have more than one probably. Again, a link, and when I'm doing Google searching, I'm not just looking for sources, I'm also looking for other key terms that I might want to add to my search term list that I could use in another Google search or possibly when I go to a subscription database like Lexis or Westlaw. And so the key term I noted here, which is a really helpful term for this research, is disrepair. And then an example of a search that I ran on Westlaw. I was in secondary sources in Massachusetts, and then I jot down my search syntax there, the search statement that I created. And I would also probably have notes as to which were the best sources. And I would also probably, unless I was limited in the resources I was asked to use, have Lexis, Bloomberg, some other sources here as well. Okay, so that section's really important, the research plan and keeping your search notes. Then I move on to the sources that I actually consulted, so the best sources that I found through all that initial searching. And the reason that the secondary sources come first is I usually start there and then move on to my primary law sources. Okay, so, and then this is just an example of the types of things I found on Westlaw. I'm putting in a link or I'm putting in the citation as I can just pull it up on Westlaw and my notes as to how good it is. Also on Westlaw, I'm saving the best sources to a folder that I've created for the client so that I can go back to those sources easily later. And I might have notes that I've created right in the source on Westlaw. You can use the features on Westlaw and Lexis to kind of annotate the sources that are the best sources. And then I have something similar for mass practice. If I notice a topic and key number on Westlaw, I list that as well as a way I can later find cases. And a few similar sources I found on Lexis, a general source, I'm making some notes, I have a link to it, and as well a link to an MCLE that I found with some notes as to the most helpful chapters and what I'm going to use it for. It's basic, but it's got the elements, damages, and defenses, so that's really important. So you see I'm going through the research process. The log is sort of set up the same way as I do the steps. The next is primary binding authority. So these are the sources I'm going to rely upon. This case that we're working on is heavily common law, so I have mostly cases, but this is also where you would put statutes, regulations, court rules, anything like that that you've found that's on point for the case. And here for my research log, I have sometimes a link to the case, but I definitely have it by a citation where I can go back and easily pull it up. And I might just have some quotes from the case with why I'm going to use it later. So I have a little quote, and then I want to use it for reasonable diligence, that principle, when I'm writing about it later. Later on, when I'm actually doing the writing, I would probably fine tune it and not just have quotes, but this is just for my own research. And again, I have another case. I have a mass SJC case as well as an appeals court case. These two cases I would use later when I was writing a memo or putting that memo to the file for the client. And as I said, this is case law, but that's because of the nature of the problem. You would also put your statutes here, again, with some kind of a link and a citation that would make it easy to pull up, and notes as to why you want to use it, or quotes from the statute itself. Okay. The section on persuasive authority, this is for cases or statutes outside of the jurisdiction that we're working in, or for lower, like trial court cases that won't have too much authority, just persuasive authority. So the source that I found that I looked at, and whether I cited it or not, if I used it for research, I'd put it in this because it's my research log, was a New Hampshire case that was talking about whether or not people can be liable, neighbors can be liable for the acts of wild animals. So if I found this case when I was doing my research, I could use this case to then do more research in Massachusetts, and if there was absolutely nothing in Massachusetts, I might want to still put this in my memo. But I know it's just persuasive, it's not mandatory authority. And by putting it in your research log this way, you're telling us that you know that it's only persuasive, it's not mandatory. Okay, finally, in the wrap-up section, there's two primary things going on in the wrapping up section. It's updating using Keysight or Shepard's, or possibly BSight, the cases and statutes that you've used, and any further updating that you need to do. For example, for statutes, if there was pending legislation that you needed to look at. So all those sorts of things that you need to do to make sure that you're relying on good law. And this is just one example. So this is one of the cases that I used. It was distinguished by another case. So this case actually had negative treatment on it, but it was for totally different facts. So it was in an employment law context. So by putting this in your research trail, if your supervising attorney says, but wait, there's a big red flag here, how come you cited a case that has a big red flag? You can quickly look at your notes and say, oh yeah, I know it, I know that, but the reason is it's a totally different context. It had to do with employment law, something like that. And it also shows us for grading purposes and also for helping you purposes that you know the case had negative treatment, but you understand that the negative treatment didn't affect it for the point of law that you want to use it for. And another time you might see negative treatment is sometimes there's a yellow flag for treatment that's in another jurisdiction. If that's the case, you would write that there as well. If there was pending legislation, but it was not affecting the statute, you could write that as well. Those are the examples of some things that you could write in the wrap-up section. This case actually had really negative treatment, a big red flag, but it really only had to do with whether a government entity is immune from liability, so it wasn't about the point of law that we were looking at. The second part of the wrap-up section is, can you really answer all the research questions? Is there anything else you need to know? And also some procedural considerations I put in this section. So like, can I bring it to court? What are the causes of action? What are the remedies I can expect? And so in this case, some of these are a stretch, but potential causes of action, negligence, trespass, nuisance. I want to remember I'm going to outline the elements of them all and think about which has the best likelihood of success. I want to list any potential defenses that Ziggy might have, in this case, fera natura, which is that he doesn't have to have control over wild animals, right? What's the statute of limitations? For this case, it's very recent, so it's not that worrisome, but I might note it for different types of cases where something has gone on for a long time And so I'm just showing you examples of things that might be in this wrap-up section, like statutes of limitation. Okay, so that's working with the research log. And again, this is just one example of a research log and just a few samples of how you would fill it out. You can use the research log to keep track of all different aspects of your research and also use it for your brainstorming before you do your research. And if you have any questions, as always, post them to the forum or send us a quick email.